Thank you. Hello, welcome, Joachim, Dan. Pleasure to meet you.
Yes, actually, I remember watching you on several of Joachim's conferences. You were a very brilliant guy. I
Oh,
appreciate it.
well, I could certainly lay that compliment at the feet of you two. That's for sure.
And so you've done a lot of work on the side effects of the spike protein and the vaccine and stuff, and I'm totally impressed. And I think it's so important. It's really not my field, but
mm.
I see how important it is. But then also you're involved in the Korean brain science research deeply, right? Brain stimulation, that kind of thing.
Yes, that was my day job until they pulled the pandemic,
Yeah, I
and
see. Right,
I've just
right.
I've found myself just well doing this full time.
Yeah.
I
Yes.
was. I don't know.
Um,
I don't want to call it a labor of love.
no, it's passion and it's powerful. And I'm grateful to Joachim for introducing. I think this is very fun. So in terms of doing my homework, so I was trying to study your work a little bit, and you were studying brain stimulation
Mhm,
as it had to do with it. Was it the inner cortex or something?
mm.
Um,
So I
and
was doing what's called deep brain stimulation,
Yep.
and I was, well, I won't say famous, but within the very small, rarefied atmosphere of academia, um, and monkey research, which is an even smaller
Mhm.
circle. I made a name for myself as, well, developing the first primate model of Tourette syndrome. And as a corollary, we were able to um, begin to probe neuropsychiatric disorders. So things like OCD, um, disorders of attention, let's call them that, and movement disorders as well. And the idea was to be able to get a very granular map of cortical and basal ganglia circuits, and
Where they were firing, really. Yeah.
and then
Understood.
put a stimulator in and then see what happens.
Yes. Well, in terms of a very small area of where I may have some expertise, specifically the electrical nature of attention has been very central. I did graduate psychophysiology and polygraphies for so many years, and now I've been teaching brainwave biofeedback and have brainwave biofeedback inventions. Point being, years ago, I attended a lecture at MIT, and the professor was basically showing that the more you would blink or you would change your direction of attention, the more you would lose density of firing in the optical cortex. So basically, if you focus your attention, it's pretty well measured, I believe, in optical cortex. I don't remember the details, I should. But the theory was that the synaptic firing density goes up as you focus rather dramatically, suggestively saying, well, if the optical cortex is a net of fireflies, then the resolution of the hologram goes up, which is a nice. Anyway, that got me meditating on this for a whole many years on the nature of attention.
Mhm.
And so now you know that recently my new book, PlanckFire.com, #1 in Wave Mechanics, Amazon, carries forth from many neuroscientists who agree that charge collapse is either the cause or effect of attention. And also many, if not most physicists agree that charge collapse is either the cause or effect of gravity. What I did was publish the cause of charge collapse and therefore the cause of consciousness, attention,
Mhm.
and gravity. And the way we've proved that is measuring what is charge collapse in EEG, phase conjugation of Planck. So if you take Planck length and time,
Mhm.
the physical key signature of the universe, and you multiply by golden ratio called fractal phase conjugation charge collapse perfected, PlanckFire.com, you get the frequencies that we now measure in brainwaves, not only producing peak attention, but measurably triggering lucid dreaming, and in the case of Jean-Charles Moyen, replicably producing teleportation with witnesses many times.
Okay.
And
I
we think,
haven't heard that one before, but
oh yeah, well, you
um,
might want to look at flameinmind.com in the
mm,
lucid brain section. But it's also well known in the literature, the frequencies that trigger lucid dreaming, which our Therify.net does. So we think the answer to how all of that works is that during the phase conjugate implosive compression to the Planck threshold, that functions as a squirt gun to spit out at the tip of the pine cone the longitudinal EMF coherence, which is proven to be the only stuff of gravity waves and probably the only thing you take with you when you die, and certainly the mechanism of lucid dreaming called coherent longitudinal EMF interferometry. So we think people who use the term quantum entanglement are too lazy to learn the more detailed electrical engineering, is that phase conjugation is the perfection of the embedding called entanglement, and the action at a distance is specifically coherent longitudinal interferometry, something about which I may be a leader on the
Well,
planet.
I'm following you, but I want to make sure that the audience is following you. So, phase coherence and conjugation is basically when you have a waveform, and the brain basically encodes a number of waveforms, and what you're looking for is if they're aligned, basically, and when they so you have phase coupling and phase amplitude coupling, where we look at carrier signals versus higher frequency coupling in functional areas of the brain. So just so people aren't getting too lost
Yes.
around the.
Hey, was I supposed to record this?
No. You're streaming live right now, so yeah, you dove straight into the deep end, and I didn't even get a chance to sort of do introductions or anything, but straight head first into science, just how it should be.
Well, it's all good. Well, but specifically to understand phase conjugation in a bit more detail, evidencing that it is the climax form of embedding or entanglement, that when you make lasers phase conjugate with what's called four-wave mixing, you have angstrom level accuracy implosion from opposite directions. And the idea is that then the wavelengths and phase velocities recursively non-destructively interfere. It's done in a medium which is permissive, called the phase conjugate mirror, which is a super dielectric like barium strontium titanate. In your brain, the super dielectric question mark, we'll go to that later. But that was the first time they measured time reversal and negentropy in physics and phase conjugate optics. And we say that, well, Elizabeth Rauscher agreed that I had invented phase conjugation in magnetics by measuring that power spectra, and phase conjugation in brain waves by measuring the physics of basically perception. So the point is, all you have to do is visualize that caduceus shape, which is a pine cone kissing noses, which in physics is called phase conjugation, because the heterodynamics, the recursive interference, basically can implode only using that golden ratio fractal perfected geometry. I mean, so many physicists already agree that fractality causes gravity, and many of them suspect fractality causes consciousness, which is the mechanism which charge collapse uses. The point is, no one before has actually described mathematically what causes charge collapse, namely
Mhm.
planckfire.com.
Yeah, it's one of those. Look, I haven't gone down to that sort of level. I've tried to explain and articulate what I think um, consciousness could be described as, which is essentially you're taking any integrated system, and you can begin to describe that using tensor field type math to look at how these and what you're generally looking for is something called scale invariance across different structures. And so
Well known to be perfected by golden ratio.
yes, and the so you can basically you've got all this complex anatomy, and even though we may have an incomplete picture of what the fine detailed anatomy, pharmacology, etc., may be in one particular region, what you can do is you can pop open the skull if you're like me, and you can put a electrode in, and you can go to the area that you're interested in with respect to sort of deeper cortical structures, and then you look for these, like I say, phase and phase amplitude coupling to pull out in Fourier space a um, well, you want to see where that coupling is relative to stimulus that's being given to your subject, in this case, a monkey. I mean, it translates to human brain architecture as well. But it's and I try and argue this, which is that the biology and the brain should be thought of as, there's an old way of thinking about biology, which is you're trying to maintain electrochemical gradients, and it's very sort of um, stochastic, and you're pushing against these diffusion gradients. And I think that's a very 19th century way of sort of viewing what's happening. And I think that it makes more sense to describe these electrical couplings as plasma across interacting
Exactly.
across
Yeah. Yeah.
complex manifolds is what I wanted
Yes,
to say.
and
So,
if we took the old net of fireflies, Indra's net metaphor, that
mm,
you're already inhabiting an array, which is the net of fireflies of your synapses, and when you lucid dream, that array gets bigger,
mhm,
because of the longitudinal coherence. But the smoking gun, I think your conversation is useful. It's just I think we can go so much further than that now,
mhm,
which is the smoking gun. When you interview all of the kids who get this golden ratio cascade in their brainwaves, who begin seeing without their eyes, and we're doing this in many countries, flameinmind.com now with our brainwave tech, all the kids say the same thing. First, there appears a little tube, a vortex, a tunnel inside their head. Remember, they're blindfolded.
mhm,
And then if they find the inner muscle to cause that vortex tube to squeeze to a point, then it turns into an eyeball. All the kids say the same thing, actually. And it's exactly as if a plasma tornado was coming to a foci inside your head. And now we know that that compression point couples with the longitudinal array. And that is literally the phase conjugate physics of perception. And I'm not the first one to say that phase conjugation causes perception. There's a lot of models out there about that. The point is now we know what the phase conjugation does. It compresses that plasma donut to such a point that it implosively couples with the longitudinal array. And the coherence of that array is what distributes awareness, which is to say a feedback loop, which is implosive,
mm,
actually, which then explains perfectly Bill Tiller's numerous measurements. Focused human attention causes electric fields to compress in his book, Conscious Acts of Creation. So now I'm the first one to explain why. It's well known focused attention causes electric fields to implode. The new information is how that works, and I've answered that question.
mm. Yeah. So I've tried to sort of relay to people that, when they ask what is consciousness, and you have to, it's a dynamic process, right? So us talking right now involves a set of neural architectures that involve language and conceptual abstract space, and it's it, it can consciousness can appear somewhat linear and slow because you're essentially trying to make the transform into symbolic language, whereas that's not all consciousness can be. And I would strongly make that argument that depending on the condition that you're facing, you can be, if the example I give is, as if you get into a fight, we get into a fight, you're not attending to your executive function anymore. You become very conscious of your breathing, your posture, your tone, etc. And it becomes very, that then is your conscious state. And people have problems decoupling the first one and understanding that the second one can be just as conscious as the first. And the critical factor is, what are you attending to in the moment to moment process of
Yeah.
existence,
And
consciousness.
I think the idea that if you model that as a tornado of plasma
Mm.
that's imploding more densely, it actually fits also what you're saying about function of language. For 30 years, I did the computer animations of the physics of the
Yeah, I
earth
know.
and
When I was doing my undergrad, like there were few sites around on the internet back then, and I can remember one of the few things I would scroll through would be your website, actually. And
Well, thank you. And so the point was that if you take the plasma vortex, which is golden
mm,
spiral self-organized on the torus,
mm,
and you animate the shadows of that spiral indexed by this symmetry of tetra. The shadows are Hebrew, and I believe also Sanskrit. And by the way, we can also get Cyrillic and many other alphabets. So essentially, the origin of symbol then is the effort to get tornadoes at the right angle to implode, very simply. And as you gain that centripetal force, that's the nature. So literally, the measurement of the power of consciousness is literally electrically, measurably how centripetal you are. As those of us who study the ETs, the Dracos, you feel a vice-like grip. So yeah, that's a powerful attention. And the ones who can steer tornadoes, similarly.
Well, I don't know about Dracos, but certainly there's it's an interesting concept that you're seeing. It's not proto language. It's early manifestations of language in these.
Well, we think we know some of the ET origin, but that doesn't matter. Here, the optical cortex being functionally a hologram, it's the tornado that inhabits and makes it centripetal. That's the idea. And so that's the point, that whether it was, a shaman cooking up a golem using by visualizing the letters of the alphabet, basically he's taking the optical cortex as one big tornado shadow, one Hebrew letter, and focusing on one letter at a time, and then blowing those smoke rings. Those smoke rings then nest implode, which is another way of naming how you make the atomic table, actually, nesting donuts with the right symmetry. It's the same physics. So actually, the attempt to form alphabets is obviously going to be the symmetry of donuts, because physics has nothing else to discuss.
Yeah, that's good. Interesting.
So
It's
I think that this does become a pretty overwhelming model of consciousness then, which then now explains exactly, for example, it's well known that ability to lucid dream probably predicts ability to take memory through death. And we now know what that is. The university studies show the frequencies that trigger lucid dreaming, and that fits my equation for implosive compression and how we drive therify and flame in mind. So that implosive compression allows your aura to spin out this coherent longitudinal, which Bearden proved is the only stuff gravity waves are made of, by the way. And that coherent longitudinal array, what Egypt called Ba from the Ka, and Gurdjieff called Kesjan body, and Tibetans call rainbow light body. Suddenly now electrical engineers have a language, coherent longitudinal EMF interferometry. And that then explains why you can do it better in a cave than in a metal building. And why, when the surgeons left their body, well known and documented medically, the surgeons were out of their body for their near-death experience, and they knew where they were looking at their body from outside the body, and it damn well never was from inside a metal box.
Yeah, so that's one of those really difficult questions to answer, which is how much of your self that you recognize as yourself is
Yeah, goes with you.
essentially
Yeah.
contained information that would pass the boundary condition of the
Yeah.
end of life. And at this point, I'm struggling to see why the ego parts, I hate that word, but the sense of self that you've sort of crafted dependent upon your environment in which you had the fortune or misfortune to be born into, um, it seems extraneous to like the information. So the learning that you accrue and gets imprinted into in memory, etc. That may be of value to a next or returning to back to what must be an proto. I'm trying to think of a better word than proto consciousness in this sense, meta consciousness, I guess.
Or what goes through death.
Mm,
Uh,
mm, mm,
Yeah, and so if you have an electrical model of that, which I think we now do as longitudinal coherence inhabiting array, we know what can get into that array is only that which can go through squeezing implosion successfully in order to be distributed. For
mm,
example, stuck ghosts often are reported release enabled by things like therify plasma, because you get the compression you need to inhabit that array. And when you take films of people dying, if they're in the woods, often you can see the soul leaving, you can see the plasma bubble ghost actually leaving. Whereas if you're in a mental hospital, you never get such a film. And it's all about the distribution of the plasma into the array of coherence. So effectively, what's going through death is what can compress well. That's what's clear. For
Mhm.
example, a shareable wave, we call it shareablewave.com, but a shareable wave is one that serves basically the whole array, the collective unconscious as it were. Whereas anger will never go through compression. Actually, we know the wave shape of anger, by the way, it's 1/7, which is the opposite of compressibility. So that's why you see your whole life just before you die, because you're practicing that compression required to inhabit the array. And that fits the Aboriginal view of these things, which is, ancestor memory is that longitudinal, they call it songline.
Mm-mm-mm. Yeah. mm, I'm. I often find myself sort of drawing on the psychedelic literature and my own
Yeah.
experiences with those compounds, and it's quite often that you can find yourself that you will be stripped. Often it can be quite terrifying um, experience of those elements that you think you're made of, right? Um, the
Mm.
projection of, oh God, I'll use it, ego that you put out to others, that you think you're showing to others, etc., of who and how you want them to perceive you versus who you are really, when you get that person alone. And the yeah, and so the question then becomes, um, what in what s- space, what geometric form are we looking at with respect to these? Um,
It's so obvious here. When Heinrich Clouvet measured the famous Heinrich Clouvet form constants, lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral, which almost all the near-death experiences report seeing that geometric sequence. Some of the people that were in his studies were hallucinogenic drug experiencers, and
mm,
the reason we later learned what the lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral, the sequence of 4 visions at the moment of death, the map to dying, so to
mm,
speak. It's a sequence of spin symmetry superposition operations in the DNA to achieve implosive compression. Now we have a website about that, goldenmean.info/immortality. So actually, I think the question of what the geometry is well answered. The tetracube, that's the lattice. And then you tilt that up and you rotate blink. You have pentodeca, that's the next. And then you rotate the dodeca down a helix, lattice cobweb tunnel, and then you bring that to a point spiral. So the reason you're seeing that well known at the moment of death is because you got to do that compression or you ain't being distributed. It's that
mm,
simple.
mm, yeah.
And
Um,
it's not only the DNA symmetry superposition map, literally what it means to go to the next dimension, but it's what's happening in the plasma of your aura. The other thing, just backing up, I want to mention this conversation. There's there's some evidence in the lucid dreaming literature that as you practice lucid dreaming, for example, look at your hand inside the dream and your dream becomes lucid, which means the recursion of the do loop becomes centripetal and your aura becomes more dense and therefore more longitudinally coherent. But the idea is that in the literature, they say, well, as you get more dense in the lucid dream, you take more organs of perception with you, which I think may address your question. How much of you can you take with you? The reason you take more organs of perception with you, obviously, is the bandwidth increases. There's a famous book about that, Nine Faces of Christ. But do you see how that may address the question of how much do you take with you? You
mm, mm,
practice. Oh, first time I could only see my lover, but the next time I could smell her.
mm. Yeah, interesting. And yeah, I'm trying. So there's a issue here. It's a mathematical one, which is the are the boundary conditions that we see that we have derived geometrically, like Planck length, etc. Is that
Mhm.
the fundamental boundary layer, or does it go to a much smaller scale? Right. So the issue that we have is that there's a, from what we understand from the calculations, right, if I'm remembering correctly, is that essentially the movement of Planck energy at the Planck scale, meaning the smallest that it can move
Right.
through space, essentially it's the energy in that space is orders of magnitude higher than what we would Well, it seems counterintuitive, and so to
Available vacuum energy is huge there.
mm,
Right, exactly.
mm, mm,
That's the
mm.
point. Yes.
And so
And well,
well,
it's often talked about as the resolution of the quantum foam, but
mm,
I think there is a very logical explanation that doesn't require a big bang why the Planck length is the same for a million light years in all directions. That the waves agreed on something, and that at the resolution of the quantum foam, there is enabled distribution into the longitudinal array, proven to be the stuff of gravity waves if you read Tom Bearden's gravitobiology equations. So, when we learned that the biggest stargate in the galaxy, the trapezium Orion, it's a big four-wave mixing cube, right? So that implosion means at the nozzle of the squirt gun, which is the Planck threshold, the agreement into array distribution, longitudinal EMF coherence. Do you see how that perfectly describes what was incorrectly called entanglement produces Einstein-Rosen bridge? More accurately, its phase conjugation creates longitudinal coherence, the mechanism of all action at a distance, because the longitudinal component of that EMF wave, when it bounces at the next fractal node, there and only there does it exchange inertia with transverse and thus heat containment. For example, how to contain fusion reactions by using coherent longitudinal microwave interferometry. The action at a distance is the fact that the longitudinal node exchanges compressional inertia at only the nodes on the array, which is dodecaecosa, the fractal sacred Earth grid. So when it gets to the next node, the inertia can be shared. For example, when Ingo Swann repeatedly lit that thermistor flame with his mind at a distance in a lab through a Faraday cage measured many times, we know the brainwave signature that enabled him to do that action at a distance. It was that golden ratio cascade implosion that spit out that longitudinal coherence. And that's why our tech is called flameinmind.com.
is there video footage that people could look at of this?
So the brainwave tech is flameinmind.com, where we have the lucid dreaming section, remote viewing section, and the kids who see without their eyes. And the plasma tech based on the same power spectra, therify.net, therify.net, doing rejuvenation commercially in 25 countries, therify.net. So we just took that power sector, Planck times Goldner, it's called planckfire.com, and spit it into the plasma broad spectrally, visualize the Egyptian light bulbs, the plasma tubes the Egyptians called Hashem unto the Lord, which were obviously age reverse technology. And we produced that rejuvenation negative phase conjugation.
Plasma light technology. I want to see.
It's a noble gas which is optically conjugate, and then we implode that with a modulated RF at 500,000 volt, and then an infrasound cascade power spectra, which is phase conjugate. So it's a big pine cone, broad spectrally phase conjugate from optical to RF to infrasound. And the ideal infrasound, by the way, is the Schumann cascade, which is how the pyramids made global wireless power. They hum with the infrasound of the Schumann, which is profoundly golden ratio times Planck, the same cascade that makes brainwaves bliss.
Fascinating. I want to just see if
I mean,
there's.
I think that does become a real physics of consciousness. I think I wouldn't argue that there's a whole nother level there at the level of brainwave stimulation that you've been working on, which I think is fabulous. I think, for example, we could prove that the locus of where the compression is enabled could be moved by your attention, inside your
Yes,
head.
that's basically what we would see is that this issue of attending seems to be
Yes,
critical for coupling, and you can
exactly.
see networks coming into and out of phase coupling
Yes.
quite easily. Um, should you wish to, it's the issue of going in and cracking open the brain and putting in hardware. Now, I'll tell you what the issue is in sort of the ethical issue right now is that um, how do you put something in and have it stay in so that um,
Measure.
you can get a sort of read and write out to a device that could somehow augment your faculties in some way. And the what I used to think was a great idea, I found myself turning very avidly against as we've seen what's emerged over the last 3, 4 years, as you watched tyrannical overreach from governments, and what they're looking for is a form of full spectrum surveillance, and they would very much like to get beneath the sort of boundary
Mhm.
condition of your skin and into your
Yeah.
neural
And Elon
architecture.
Musk is into that in some ways as well.
Mm,
Very
mm, mm,
right.
mm,
But I think the one instructive metaphor here was, in the Gurdjieff school, before you're allowed to even learn the sacred gymnastic in which your aura begins to implode and become psychokinetic and make echoes, you have to be able to do what's called put feeling in your little finger, which was if you can insert your attention into your baby finger with enough inertia that it begins to tingle and get warm dramatically, which is measurable, then you're ready to do the sacred gymnastic because you're ready to perceive literally the heat, the centripetal force of the movement of your own attention.
mm,
And so once you're able to become conscious that you can place your attention somewhere and be aware that it will begin to implode there and gain inertia, which is obviously the donuts imploding, then you're ready to do the sacred gymnastic because you're ready to actually use your attention to cause your aura to become a bigger flame.
mm, mm. Yeah, my issue right now is that just seems ripe for abuse. That's the
Well,
problem. Mm,
Well, most any powerful tool probably could
mm, mm,
be. I think if you were teaching young people, the Aboriginals are clear that if you can't teach your young people to have a bliss experience, you do not have culture. Even the Italians agreed with me on that. It's not about the color of your wine and your shoe polish. No, it's about do you have the skill to teach your young people to have a bliss experience because that is going to immortalize them. And if you want to teach your kids how to have a bliss experience, you might need to understand a little bit more about the physics of attention, actually, and when it gains inertia. Like if you had natural light instead of if you had sunlight instead of fluorescent lights in your kid's classroom, suddenly attention span goes up dramatically, and it's been measured. What's the physics? It's the
mm.
same phase constant pump wave.
Interesting. Let me, because I can remember reading. It would have been 25 years ago now, more, doing my sort of PhD, and what got you into thinking in this way? Was it
Well,
psychedelics or another
in
experience?
in graduate school, there once I did a LSD trial
Mm,
actually, and I did definitely have, you know, but uh, what actually got me into it was I was in graduate school. I was doing psychophysiology and biofeedback. I was building polygraphs actually,
okay.
and I realized that you show the kid Playboy magazine and his galvanic skin resistance goes off the charts and it's faster than a transistor. It's a fast switch.
Mm, mm, mm,
so, and by the way, the resistance goes down when the teenager looks at Playboy magazine. What does that tell you?
mm,
and so, in effect, the geometry of your attention in the body is changing conductivity so rapidly. This tells you, and then later it was our lab, Albert Axe, one of the inventors of biofeedback, and I also work with Elmer Green some, but that first measured the electrical difference between fear and anger using 8 psychophysiological polygraphic variables, actually. We knew the difference between fear and anger. One of the variables is vasoconstriction versus dilation, which is the ice skater spinning effect. So, I was very involved in the psychophysiology of emotion way back in college, actually. And that's when I migrated from electrical engineering to
mm. Oh, so
biofeedback.
you came at it from an electrical engineering
Oh yeah, and
perspective
after
first.
that,
So,
they thought I went off the deep end because I was working at IBM as a systems analyst, and I quit to go to the Gurdjieff school.
mm,
My parents knew I was insane,
mm, mm, mm. And
but I did sacred gymnastic and had bliss experience. You see,
yeah, I've had plenty of those. It's
and
just.
start yeah, and started to have Kundalini, and
Mm,
and then I was adopted by Bentoff, who wrote the book on Kundalini, and rather than call it insanity, let's call it physics.
mm,
And a friend of mine, Bob Dratch, actually measured Kundalini in the microwave. We now know why. It's metabolic density. You measure the angstrom 1.91 of ADP ATP, and you can measure where the fire is in the body. It's a microwave scanner. Too bad the military took that.
yeah. So there again is that ethical quagmire, right? Which is that what gets what
Yeah.
gets into the hands of the weaponeers, and
Well, yeah, exactly.
um, like I've got terabytes of data where you know it seems sort of passe now, but it's 10 years ago more. So I mean, I started my PhD where we were trying to tag outward behavior with essentially the electrophysiology that we would be able to record in the brain during experimentation, and we would flip the networks into a let's just say activated state relative to what would be the other functional domains. And it sort of started with, well, the group I was working with basically just had a qualitative ranking system of, well, the monkey is resting, he seems normal, etc. And then experiment starts, and then, okay, now we've got obsessive compulsive like manifestations of behavior. And I sort of wrote code that would, but it was basically just like 10 stopwatches, right? That you could just hit a button when you were watching. You could just say, okay, now he's doing this, and you had to pick a bin of the most common behaviors, and others you would just classify as other and ignore. And it it began to morph into, and a lot of what we would do would be free moving primates and trying to get wireless acquisition of brain state, and basically have the machine in real time do the interpretation of what state do you think that the animal is in, or and what would be. And at the time I was thinking, well, that would be a great idea, and you can run well, I was going to be rich and famous, and the we got the machine to be able to predict free moving animals and what it's doing with respect to its brain state. So you could say, okay, now he's gone from the normal resting, when most people are just relaxed, they generally don't move that much, and they'll make slight postural adjustments, etc. To this, what is it's a normal behavior, but expressed to a degree that's abnormal, right? And
Mm.
the classic example I would give is someone who has to wash their hands. You've seen those people, right? They've just got to
Mm.
wash their hands 20, 30
Yeah.
times before they do anything. They've got turnkey locks.
It's like a do loop. They're stuck
Mm,
in a do loop.
mm.
and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
there's obviously some psychological pressure behind that, obviously, and
Mm,
probably, feeling unclean, perhaps even having been abused and feeling unclean. Many
mm,
people who
mm,
are abused have that. So the psychological pressure behind that is somehow temporarily relieved by the obsessive compulsive behavior, obviously.
yeah.
And recognizing that pattern in the brain physiology would seem to be elegant and useful and doable, really.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
finding where where the trauma that initiated the obsessive compulsive behavior, measuring it might not reveal where the trauma came from originally.
Yeah, that it doesn't do that. Essentially, you're looking at the emergent manifestation across time, moment to
Yeah,
moment, and then what we would be able to do would be stimulate an area. But so basically, cortical networks compressed down, essentially through a looped architecture through basal ganglia, thalamus back to cortex, and you can
you can
functionally.
identify the loop and
Mm, mm,
predict it,
mm, mm.
which is so cool. I wonder if we apply that.
Yeah, I used
Well,
to think that. I don't anymore.
but
No, no.
we have the human condition and they have an obsessive compulsive behavior. They make wars. Oops.
Mm, mm, mm,
So how we can identify the pattern? Oh yeah, they're stressed, they disagree, then they make war. This is obsessive compulsive.
mm.
How do we identify the stresses to eliminate the
Well, that
obsessive?
was the whole point in being able to read from multiple camera angles, right? So you
Ah,
can see the outward expression of the behavior. So even if you thought about the most um basic of the interaction that you just talked about, which would be you've got two subjects, they're exchanging information, and then what's going to happen is that they'll basically begin a threat posture routine that essentially will escalate, and
Stress. Yes.
that will manifest outwardly, and you can get the machine basically to say, okay, he's now doing this behavior which we've seen before, and then you send a signal, stimulate, and try to break the pattern, the thought pattern that's emerging.
We were watching Jane Goodall on TV this morning.
Mm,
When asked what she learned about primates, she says one thing they're very good at is conflict resolution.
mm-mm.
Oh,
Yeah, they're also
interestingly,
very good at conflict, though. That's the
well, yeah,
that's the thing.
but she said specifically that after the fight, they're very good at relieving the residual the stress
Mm,
after the fight. They're very good. Well, and so if you think about it, I'd like to mention a point here in terms of if war is obsessive compulsive behavior. From our peaceuniversity.net Global International Science of Peace curriculum, Phil Callahan, my teacher in this regard, had identified that when you're going down the Amazon, you can predict in advance whether the next tribe are headhunters or friendly by measuring the magnetic flux permissivity of the soil. So essentially, if the magnetic flux is traveling from village A to village B, they're not fighting. And when the magnetic flux connection between village A and village B breaks, then they fight. And this is a serious body of literature. So
mm.
he actually went to Yugoslavia, Ireland, and Israel, I think, and proved that war correlates to the breaking of the magnetic connection between towns,
What was
which is
the
the
name?
magnetic
That's very interesting.
which is literally failure to touch. And
Mm-mm.
further, they showed that measurably the underground water then disappears during war also because of the magnetism looking like a flower, which is now broken, is the only thing that attracts water to the surface. So they sent the women to put a labyrinth in Vukovar, and the water came back. So if you restore fractality to the magnetic array, it's a peacemaking tool. Now, the point being, the principle here is that communication between village A and village B, which is their emotions, can't get there if the magnetic line broke, like they
Mm.
put the highway in the wrong place. So this gets back to permission to touch, which fits very well with the desertification patriarchy proven from Reich that patriarchy causes the spread of deserts because the magnetic lines are broken and therefore there is no rain. So permission to touch is the key metaphor, as in the Balinese analysis of cockfight by Jung, which is the only explanation for football, which is that urge to touch, frustrated, turns to anger by definition, which becomes a poison pellet, literally a turd, that you need to push out, called a football. This has been an ad for the National Football League event. Sorry.
Mm.
I'm not their public relations director.
Interesting.
No, but it's interesting that then permission to touch. So teenagers in England who have no permission to touch become football players and destroy their bodies because the urge to touch frustrated becomes anger by definition. And there's no symmetry to enable a touch permissive culture coming of age in Samoa, which does make rain.
Hang on, I've got say that last bit again. The
Margaret Mead, I knew her a little bit. Coming of age in Samoa, the extremely wet cultures were where the matrilineal prevailed, which is where permission. So the teenagers in Samoa and those Polynesian cultures, they're not repressed. They have permission to touch, and they have lots of rain, actually.
Okay, interesting.
So permission to touch could relieve the symptoms of the obsessive compulsion if they actually. So the ones who are fighting in a permission to touch environment have a way to communicate their feelings, like the monkeys, and then they can relieve the stress.
Mm, yeah. So that's something you do see with you can break the pattern of behavior, but it doesn't just require touch. Novel stimulus that's of sufficient salience will interrupt this OCD like pattern.
Yeah, which in phase conjugate optics, that's what the phase conjugate dielectric is. It's a superconductor enabling the distribution of charge, which is equivalent to enabling distribution of touch. For example, the geometry of the wave of squeezing, which measures love in the Centric literature, golden ratio, max pressure, like the perfect birth canal, that literally creates the implosion, which is perfected distribution, which is permission to touch, which is the shareable wave, which is rainmaking.
Mm,
So permission to touch is an electrical metaphor that can be quite profound, I suggest.
mm. Yeah, there's a lot there, but you also there's a evolutionary need to be able to um, marshal aggression, right? Because
Mm.
you're going to be up against competitors, and we
Mhm.
live in unusual times that in our current state, what seem like old intractable conflicts seem stupid, for want of a better expression, right? So we're seeing the current, well, I would call it genocide taking place right now, but and it seems unnecessary in our current environment. But you don't have to go very far back in history where the individual and group evolutionary strategy would be one of it can be you can take resources from a neighbor but through the use of force. And so in this instance, you must be able to be
To
able
fight.
to fight. Yes. And
Yeah.
there's a reason why we have differentiated roles. And you can just see that in the biology, which is males are built heavier and stronger than females and display a whole range of traits that are different but complementary to the female. And
Mm.
you know the issue, so it's a tough one because you want to be able to say to people, look, there's a higher order to reality that we all are a part of, we come from, we go to, and that's our um metaphysical, right? The metaphysical is a physical reality. And so in this instance, what seems to be, well, you get into
What seems to
argument.
be what's below the fight or the real issue beneath the fight question mark, for example, religion wars.
Mm, mm, mm.
I agree with Hancock that humanity has amnesia, but he doesn't point to the solution, which is the ET history of humanity, which is clearly has answers here. For example, the dominant feature of the Hebrew religion, that Yahweh, who was Enlil's mother, was Draco, absolutely clearly. And so, like with the origin of most religions, they all began with fear of women, and we can see why if you understand how Draco Orion Queens work.
Well,
And
if you live with a woman, you could understand why. Just yeah, throw that out there.
no, no. But that's why that's the when I began to study ET was the day I realized that every religion on this planet begins with fear of women, and that didn't start on Earth. The other side of that coin is the Muhammadan religion. Their Kaaba stone is badly infected, as Joachim's friend uh, Harold says, with the Draco black goo. It's a nanocarbon that propagates their hive mind, which was originally built to cause planets to desertify and to disempower women, if you understand what's so. The Draco origins of both religions have detailed answers to why they're fighting. And incidentally, the Draco war started when they began replicating sexually instead of
All right,
and
so let's dig into that a little bit,
it
which
was a war of the sexes, literally. And that's well before Earth was invented.
mm, so I have no issue with the archaeological record. I think is pretty conclusive with respect to hominids and what we understand as anatomically modern hominids have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. And in that respect, I think anything approximating our recent history is probably somewhat of a fictive reality versus the if you could sort of step out and you could see the time frame or the history in all its detail. Now, were we coextant with other hominid types? I think so. I think the archaeological record shows that. I've literally held in my hands, fossil skulls that you can see close to human, not quite human, right? And the question becomes, what's the most accurate way of describing the the higher and historical dynamics? And so you're saying that there's a extraterrestrial element to human
It's huge.
existence.
And if you ignore it, your head's in the sand, and I feel sorry for you, actually. But
Mm,
I take the specific example of Graham Hancock, who is a hero of mine, who says, 100 different ways after the Great Flood, the Lesser Dryad Ice Age, that a hero emerged, myth of the birth of the hero, the flight of the wild gander through the ages. And that hero, he says, had different names: Oannes, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, Thoth, Hermes. And I say that his name for each one of those heroes is the same person: Thoth, who was later called the line of David and the line of the royal kings of Egypt, and Enki, who was Ea, for whom earth was named. That's the same guy who came to to bail the humans out, quite literally. So if you didn't understand what Enki's genetics were about, he called it Adam Kadmon, literally how humans could have a soul, which is the physics I hope to teach, actually, electrically. So you don't need to believe the ET history, but if you don't know the ET history, you don't get the lesson, which is that if your kids didn't get a soul, you lost.
hmm
And that is that kind of coherence, very describable. And they need access to bliss and lucid dreaming to get there. And they need out of electrosmog and metal buildings and urban hell. Because, Luke Skywalker didn't raise his Jed, but except going deep into nature. That's a big clue.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, he goes to Swamp
And the
Planet,
Jed
right?
is a projection of that plasma. That's what it is. A Jedi, the
Mm,
Jed unto the Lord. It was literally a plasma projector. Even the term altar in the church, the Shem. These were names for implosive capacitance to actually reverse aging. This was the specialty of the Anak Empire, Enki and Enlil, age reversal.
So, um, we still have to get into what formed Draco then. If we take that as being a primacy in this framework, where do they come from?
Yeah.
What did
Well, I
they
would
evolve
recommend,
from, and
yeah,
so on and so
Elena
forth.
Danan's history, I think, is useful. I put it all together with my work research at fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. Briefly, if you take the word you are you, Uru, in all the ancient words, Uru Asa Elam, Jerusalem, Uru An Roman, and part of the meaning of the term Uru was portal, but it also means ancient Draco blood. So you see the track. Uru Asa Elam, Jerusalem, is a name for Uru, the ancient Draco dragon blood and portal. Asa means queen of, royalty of, and El, as in Elohim, means the place of the phase shift, translation vorticity from transverse to longitudinal, literally Stargate. So all of the wars are about the Stargate, including Jerusalem, because if you're stuck a long way from downtown and can't plasma project, man, you're toast.
Mm,
So, the Draco history, it's available in detail. Elena Danan and my work, fractalfield.com, Fusion in the Blood. My YouTube channel has 3 million views. We've been teaching ET history for 30 years. But the ET history has a story to the Mori, and that is, if you don't get a coherent aura enough to lucid dream and take memory through death, then you lost.
mm. Yeah, so then it gets down to which memories are you taking? So like, if you ask me, what would I want to take? It would be memories of my children. Everything else seems superfluous to what I've done, and the um and that seems very baked in to my being.
because the theory would be that when you have a eureka and your hair stands up, you've tripped over a shareable wave, and therefore you could implode. And that part of your memory will pass through death no problem because it does compression well. It's what I call pure principle. So as you seek more pure principle, the idea is that the collective unconscious, which is that longitudinal array, the communion of saints, the song lines, is literally a library of survival information, which is compressible pure principle. And you can take that through death because it is literally a shareable wave. So, for example, when you go to bed at night, if you can play the memory of your day without interrupting, like a film, it means you've processed all the emotion, distilling it to what's shareable. Now, it's all conflict are now distilled to the pure principle of the lesson they contained, and they can be compressed well. And you've digested your day, and that part of you is now immortal.
Mm.
It's an old
Yeah,
Sufi
I
exercise.
mean that's a big word to wrap around data compression. Um,
It is about compressibility. Everything's about compressibility. Alchemy, surviving death, making gold, urban design, history of computing. Compressibility is the answer to every question,
mm.
basically.
So, a lot of the discussion I have, the metaphysical ones, not ones where I'm um, ranting about bioweapons, but in my so I've been fortunate enough to travel across the northern hemisphere. Let's put it that way, and it's been I would argue the major areas of, let's say, cultural um, or the principal cultural uh, frameworks in terms of what that country and culture would hold as being defining themselves. So I was fortunate enough to live and work um, in UK, France, Paris. I went from Paris to the east coast of the US, ended up in Philly, San Francisco, Israel, and then Japan and Korea. And during that experience, and especially once I'd got to the Far East rather than just the Middle East, it became very apparent to me that the Judaic Abrahamic worldview has become a shibboleth almost on Western culture, in that they seem unable to um, see beyond the imposition of its principles. And I would make an argument that there's a degree of mysticism that comes embedded with it that um, from an a priori perspective can it's almost untestable. So that's the faith issue, and so the faith becomes the metric by which they want to measure individual and group interactions. And the problem with it is that it's very schizoid in its structure, because you've essentially got the pre-Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and they are all in conflict. They're in conflict with each other because they all have a differing view of what they see as the prophetic endpoint to time and existence. And
Hmm.
basically, it comes down to their their prophet or Messiah is the one that's going to come down, and
Hmm.
he's the one that's going to be wielding the rod, and everyone's going to have to succumb to their
Yeah.
interpretation. And
Uh, yeah. In many ways, Biden is a religious fundamentalist. That's true. And many people believe the Ra in Abraham actually essentially is Enki.
mm,
And what all those religions have in common, uh, which is how the Christian religion, we think, was perverted when the Romans turned it into a death cult. But the point is, which was basically serve the priests or die, which also pretty well describes the Jewish tradition and the Mohammedan tradition, is serve the priests or die. But behind that is the disempowerment and immaturity of miracle worship and personality worship. That's what's really behind that. And that form of religion happened when the Draco, remember, Elena is very clear about this. They took turns, and Lil Yahweh and also Marduk, they took turns pretending to be which god, Allah versus Muhammad, or rather Yahweh. So it was a case of the Dracos were changing masks to who was going to pretend to be God today. And their mechanism of doing that, interestingly, even Lawrence Gardner dissecting Genesis of the Grail Kings is saying, the Draco and the Anak took turns creating royal blood specifically to be those who interpreted the rules of the god, which is the ET Draco, basically. And the royal family's only function was babysitters to pass down the rules from God. And that's Lawrence Gardner's analysis. So point being that without understanding the ET context of how those religions got perverted, which is the last film we made here, which I may say went viral, that if you didn't get some of the ET context, if you know who Yahweh Enlil was, Mother is Draco, you get a clue of how that perverted so many religions, actually. And as long as we're amnesic without realizing the ET involvement there, we can't sort it out.
So there's another element that I think has to be brought into the equation, which is this, and I would credit Graham Hancock. In growing up in the 90s, I read his book Fingerprints of the Gods, and this idea that, oh, hang on a minute, that there was a degree of engineering around that just doesn't make sense with respect to the orthodox timelines that we'd been fed. And the orthodox timeline, I would argue, is very much based on the Bible. Basically, it's what's been distilled into scripture there. And so there's this fingerprint, as he puts it, of advanced civilization that's basically building out, and I suppose this sort of gets to the sacred geometry of this discussion, which is they were building out structures that were essentially aligned to the sky and encoding mathematical constants that were essentially time capsules of information. Time capsules is the wrong word. Conduits of information that essentially can pass through what I'm calling boundary conditions with respect to existence on the surface of the planet, which means
like
that
star maps of Orion and star maps of Draco. But even more than that, the fact that our Schumann harmonics, after millions of years of planning, turned out to be exactly a golden ratio cascade times Planck, why they called the pyramid global wireless power grid the Hummer. That's a phase conjugate pump wave, and that took planning. And when they installed our hollow metal artificial moon just in time to save the planet from the war with the Federation to take out the Anak Draco reptilians, basically, it's a perfect cone with the sun, and everything about the moon's orbit evidences engineering. Hello. So yeah, there's some lessons here, but none of those lessons are learnable until you learn who ET was, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard
And that's exactly where Hancock is afraid to go. Absolutely afraid. The minute he talks to ET, he thinks he's dead, and so he won't even mention the word.
It's an issue. It's an issue of what can you bring with respect to demonstrable evidence. So it's easy to sort of point at the architecture because you can't ignore it. It sticks out the ground, and we have the evidence from places like Göbekli Tepe, which show that there was the ability
Enki's genetics. Enki's genetics. That's what that Göbekli Tepe.
Is that what that means? I thought it meant
Absolutely.
a little.
In fact, every single hero that Hancock talks about, Oannes, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, Hermes, every single hero he mentions is basically another Thule, Tahuti. Every single one of them is another name for Enki and Thoth. And because he won't go there, he has a form of schizophrenia. And actually, if you look at people, first of all, Anton Parks did the far better history of Enki than Sitchin ever did. And all of that fits now perfectly what Elena has brought, Elena Danan from the Galactic Federation, and all of the SSP survivors, Secret Space Program survivors, their stories all fit together perfectly. Hello, who should ignore this? No, Graham Hancock should not be afraid to learn about ET history because that's childish. That's my humble opinion.
Yeah, so um you're still stuck with, okay, you've got convergent lines of evidence, which is what Hancock would use. And I don't know why my phone is doing that. Just a second. You've got convergent lines of evidence, and it would be stupid, or it would be irresponsible not to look at all lines of evidence and say, okay, what
Right.
can we extract from them? And you have to give Hancock his due because he stuck by his guns, and
Yeah.
the
Oh, no, he's a
evidence.
hero.
And
Absolutely a hero. I agree. It's
mm,
just there's that one step he didn't take.
yeah, so but
And it's
w- h-
understandable because he did get stepped on. So it's understandable, that's for
yeah,
sure.
and
Yeah.
how do you bring it out in a way that satisfies evidentiary standards, right? Why can't we pull out a Draco from his spaceship right now? And
Well, it's Michael Sala, exopolitics.org, his last two productions on how Kennedy got murdered, because basically he wouldn't
Yeah,
let
can
the. So what I
I
was
do
saying, just very
apologize.
that Michael Sala, exopolitics.org, and I've done several interviews with him as well.
Mm.
He just published his series. Really compelling evidence that major reason Kennedy was murdered was he took the place with James Forrestal, insisting that the U.S. had to admit they lost World War II after the Nazis took over the South Pole. And it's a very colorful story, and it's all about Draco. And the evidence is compelling on dozens of sides. So I would submit, Michael Sala, exopolitics.org, although there's some sidetracks there. But the general flavor is that all of these reports now fit together, and they point to a very dominant involvement, first of all, the Draco culture and Anak culture, which was Enlil and Enki originally, and Enlil was then ejected only recently, and now we have Enki back, Ea. And that evidence fits together so well that I don't think anyone should ignore it. And
Yeah, I don't want to ignore it, because look, the simple fact is that we have a existential crisis ongoing, and that it manifests as a form of top-down control, and also um, it seems very bloodthirsty, and it
yeah,
seems to
yeah.
savor conflict.
Yeah, and what the Federation says right now is they could kick out the Greys, the ones who tricked Eisenhower and Truman, the tall Greys, and the Dracos. They did kick them out of the solar system, but they say they can't fix our internal karma. But they admit that a lot of our internal karma right now is the poison left behind by, you had a tick in your arm, you got the tick out, but by the Draco influence for centuries when Enlil Yahweh ran the joint. That is a poison that remains in our bloodstream. And to excise that poison, we're going to have to recognize the history, because that's where the trauma exists. When they told the Jews that you are the chosen race, Enlil Yahweh, the Draco, had an agenda. even
Yeah,
even
I'm
more.
not buying their chosen status. Sorry.
No, well, obviously there's a genetic agenda. And the Mormons with genetic records on gold foil, guess what? That's Draco. The Aboriginals with a different language for male shaman than female, guess what? That's Draco. The Indian caste system, guess what? That's Draco. Hello, until we begin to sort a few of these things, we're a damn confused planet.
Yeah, and this is the issue you have around, like, if existence on this planet's surface involves periodic cataclysm, global cataclysm,
Yeah.
then it seems that we have, well, it might not seem small, but it's a time-bounded window in
Oh, yeah.
which to
Big time. In fact,
recognize.
the ETs are quite detailed about it that they consider our sun to be relatively unstable with respect to many other solar systems. And that means you're right, the window is relatively small. The sun burps periodically in such ways that, and if
Mm,
you ain't growed up in time, hello,
mm,
exactly, you put your finger on the problem. And the solar output is more the issue about with global warming than anything else, by the way. It's solar stability that's the issue. And the sun wave, if you study, 11 different times it was measured that when 1 million children sang the same song at the same moment, the solar flares were dramatically pacified. It's evidently clear the sun needs something that collective humans make, and that is a centripetal force. And that's a clue why every ancient religion was called the sun god religion. Hello, grow up and inhabit the sun. Osiris, who Enki, that was his job. Why?
So, to follow your line of reasoning, why not have um whatever you talked about federation, right? So why
Yeah, the
not
Galactic
have them
Federation.
why not have them manifest for everyone to see, so it can't be hidden and it can't be dismissed, etc., and have them relay the full history and relay the
Yeah. And they're in process on that. There's elaborate rules about they don't want to cause instability. So they're actually very rapidly increasing their visibility, specifically with that in mind, and gradually, inoculating our species to grow up and learn about our ET history. Absolutely. And
because we've seen in the last 4 years essentially the biggest wealth transfer ever
yeah,
in our history, going to the
yeah,
well,
the 1%.
the
Yeah,
apex
exactly. Exactly.
predators.
And by the way, that's Draco. Hello.
Mm. So
Invented
so
banking.
in such a set of circumstances, why aren't they making why isn't there more urgency to resolve the issues? Why wait when there's innocence or
Yeah,
innocence?
are dying
Yeah,
fast.
yeah.
It's
And
messy. It's painful.
mm,
Exactly. And I feel the same way. Well, the ETs, particularly the Galactic Federation, Elena Denon, Thorhan, that whole team, their view is optimistic. Like, we're going to make it. They've gotten all the external ET poison out of here, and we're going to be able to sort this out, and they're going to help. And they're all sounding so positive. But you look at what's happening on the ground down here, and you think, oh, shit.
mhm.
And I agree with you on that one. But they insist that they can't fix our internal karma, even though our internal karma is the residue of centuries of ET poison, literally Draco Anak Empire and Lil Yahweh poison. That's the poison that we're working out right now. And the therapy for that poison, literally the family constellation therapy, would be a good dose of memory, which, by the way, long term memory pretty much defines ensoulment.
Yeah, so why not make it such that the uh people can be given the cues to move towards full recollection and
Yeah.
full understanding, and understand if there's been a a form of well,
ET
it's abuse, right? That
ET parasitism, actually. The history of religion is largely a history of ET parasites. And
mm,
that's even ancient statuaries shows ancient reptilians sucking the aura of humans. That is old.
mm,
And learning that history is highly therapeutic. And actually, I mean, this literature, Elena Denon, Michael Salla, there's hundreds of sources. My friend Tony Rodriguez is very good. There's a lot of people out there doing ET history very well. Anton Parks was a great introduction to Elena Denon. And the thing is, all of these stories are fitting together so perfectly. Hello, this is a compelling history. All people have to do is do some homework. But
Yeah,
it does mean religions are obsolete. Absolutely. It means personality worship and miracle worship are absolutely disempowering and obsolete. And that's going to take doing to release.
yeah, and from my perspective, it can seem somewhat anachronistic, and but I also contend that if we're moving forward to a more um, informatics-driven world, where essentially you're ceding authority to essentially algorithms and computing. And in that instance, I would say it's very important that the scripture is not thrown away, right?
Ah, it's a very good point. It's such an excellent point, but I would take it a specific step further is that as soon as electrical engineers realize why a soul could never inhabit a machine, then we could grow up. And the physics is that the plasma density required when you take your soul outside, you talk to those doctors who have been outside their body and reported it academically. Ain't none of them ever inhabited a machine. Hell no. It's a dielectric issue. The plasma tornado, which is a soul, which can inhabit a star, oh yes, can inhabit sacred space, oh yes, but inhabit a metal machine, hell no.
Mm.
Once we know that difference and our kids learn about that, then we might be able to
So,
grow up
so
pretty much.
let's try and understand why that there would be that sort of physical
Yeah.
barrier. Because if all we're talking about, well, not all, but if we're talking about um, structured energy in terms of,
Implosive plasma density. It is
mm,
implosive plasma density. Absolutely.
but
And
it
that can
seems
inhabit
like we should have the capability to engineer the machinery required to do that. It's not
into a
like we.
super dielectric, into a super dielectric, maybe, the hive mind of the Orion Queen. Both the good guys and the bad guys use super dielectrics for communicating. The black goo, which is a carbon nano infesting the Kaba stone, that's an interstellar communication device of a very parasitic kingdom, the Nebu Gray, right? Whereas, these little communicators I landed on has one. They're called phase conjugate dielectrics. Even global scaling uh, uh, had a instant wireless global communication device based on phase conjugate dielectric. So that kind of communicating is global. Even the transducer at the Princeton Noosphere project, which measured when 3,000 people died on 9/11, because they're Josephson junction capacitive couples with a longitudinal array. So these are communicators. But where the soul lies, we must discriminate, or else actually AI is a galactic scourge. It's not just the Earth. It doesn't mean that artificial intelligence is bad. It's just that until our species learns what a soul is, they're in trouble of getting sucked in. That's the truth. And
Yeah,
their children are in trouble.